They fled war and death in Sudan, Eritrea, and the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Some of them ended up in Israel, hoping to find a safe place to raise families.
קודם כל, להיות פליט זה לא רצון שלנו ולא בחירה שלנו בכלל. אני לא יכלתי לחיות פשוט באריתריאה, אני לא יכלתי לעשות כלום, לא יכלתי להרגיש כמו בני אדם.
The African asylum seekers say they live with a constant threat of arrest and deportation.
The official Israeli policy is we are uninterested in massive illegal immigration.
Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says African asylum seekers are not often who they say they are.
They don't seek asylum in Israel. They seek jobs in Israel.
But the rights groups helping them say these people are being singled out.
I think that what the government was trying to do is to play in between the law. So we can deport them, but we will make their life so miserable so they won't have other options.
We are refugees! We are refugees!
Tens of thousands of African asylum seekers are stuck with no idea of what to do next. They are not welcome to stay, and they can't go back home. Adding to their confusion is Israel's latest attempts of renewing diplomatic ties with the African continent.
Israel is coming back to Africa, and Africa is coming back to Israel.
But many African asylum seekers see a disconnect between Israel's diplomacy in Africa and how it's treating Africans at home. Osman Ali's memory of his two dead cousins and his home burned to the ground still haunts him. In 2003, he was 17 when the war in Sudan's Darfur region began. After enduring 7 years of conflict, Ali and his family fled north.
I came to Egypt from Sudan, and that was my destination. But in Egypt, then, like the Egyptian government usually, and security forces usually work with the Sudanese government, and many people were retained forcibly.
Ali says he was afraid of being persecuted in Egypt. So he headed to the Sinai border between Egypt and Israel in 2011 during the Arab Spring. He paid smugglers to cross the border, hoping to eventually be granted asylum in Israel. Ali says it was basically a near-death experience.
In front of us is Sinai Israeli border with Egyptian border control. And Egyptian border control, so hard people. They immediately shot people randomly.
For decades, you could walk across the border between Egypt and Israel. But in 2013, the Israeli government built a fence.
Everybody who came across Sinai was put in prison. When we came, we were not allowed to seek asylum as refugees. Israel were not giving us a chance to seek asylum. So we fought very hard in order to get application for asylum. They didn't allow until the end of 2013. And in 2013, we started applying for refugee claims. But since then, we're still living without any recognition or whatever.
Ali is one of 50,000 African asylum seekers who found their way to Israel before the border fence went up. Many have been imprisoned for up to 2 years, but freedom came with its own problems.
The people whom we got in, they were released, and gave you one ticket for bus from desert Negev to central bus station in Tel Aviv, and that is your destination.
Thousands of hungry and jobless African asylum seekers made Tel Aviv their new home, causing tension with locals who want them gone.
Half of the people in Atikva and other neighborhoods are people that came in from Africa and took over the neighborhoods.
תרבות של עולם שלישי, של המון מיזוגניה, המון שוביניזם, המון הומופוביה, והמון זלזול. זלזול ברשויות, זלזול בחוק, זלזול בתושבים.
אני בעד שהם ילכו לאן שהם צריכים ללכת. המדינה הזאת היא מדינה קטנה, זו מדינת יהודים. נועדה רק ליהודים. אני לא גזעני, לא אנטישמי, לא שום דבר. אבל זה לא... הערבוב פה ביחד, המיקס הזה, לא יביא לתוצאות טובות. לחלוטין. ראינו את מה שקרה בירושלים, וזה יתחיל לגלוש. הדרום הוא בפני פיצוץ, הדרום תל אביב.
In 2014, Israeli politicians changed the law to allow African asylum seekers to be detained at the Holot Detention Center for up to a year in defiance of a high court order. The law also allowed police to arrest African asylum seekers without charge, and by the end of last year, more than 13,000 people had been detained in Holot. We met Avdat Ashmil, an Eritrean asylum seeker held in detention in Holot for almost a year. Ashmil said he received a letter from the Israeli government.
בסופו, אפריל שבה ממשלת ישראל ביקשה ממני להגיע לכאן, קיבלתי הוראות להגיע לכאן לחולות. אמרו, או חולות או למדינה שלישית. אנחנו היינו ישנים בחדר 10 אנשים. אותו שירותים, פה בחולות, אנחנו היינו בפנים. אתה רואה את ההול הקטן, היינו, על יד הזה היה כל החדרים. בחדר אחד היינו ישנים 10 אנשים, היה לנו שירותים אחד, ומקלחת אחד. אם בני אדם אחד חולה, היינו חולים, כולנו היינו חולים. היינו מאוד סובלים מזה. לא יכלנו להתעסק על העניינים באמת, האמת שלנו. העניינים שאנחנו באמת נלחמים כדי לשנות המצב במדינה שלנו. אז בגלל שהיינו פה כמו כלא, פשוט פספסנו המון הדברים, לא יכלנו לעשות את זה. אז זה אומר שחזרנו המון שנים אחורה.
Israeli NGOs like the Negev Refugee Center put pressure on the government to release African asylum seekers from Holot.
I think that what the government was trying to do is to play in between the law. So we can deport them, but we will make their life so miserable so they won't have other options.
And after 4 years in operation, Holot was finally shut down in 2018. More than 10,000 African asylum seekers like Avdat Ashmil were released. By law, they are required to renew their residency permits every 60 days. But they soon found out that there were more restrictions.
כשיצאתי, כשהשתחררתי מהחולות, נתנו לי ויזה. אסור לעבוד ולהתגורר ב7 ערים. ב7 ערים לא יכלתי לעשות כלום. אז לפני שבאתי לחולות, אני הייתי בנתניה. לנתניה לא יכלתי לחזור, למה הוויזה שהם נתנו לנו, הייתי אסור לחזור לשם. כאילו כתוב לוויזה, 7 ערים. אסור לעבוד ולהתגורר.
And it's not just their movement that was restricted. After Osman Ali was released from Holot in 2016, he was issued a permit that forbade him from working in Israel. And asylum seekers with jobs were hit with another law that came into effect in May 2017. It requires them to deposit 20% of their salaries into an account they only can access once they leave the country. Their employers are also required to pay 16% in addition to that. Thousands of African asylum seekers, like Ali's friend, Tayeb Mohammed, lost their jobs because of the law.
When this law started, it affected me very, very much. Because it's been taken for me like every month, it's about 1,700. It's been taken from my salary for 2 years. That's what is included here, if you saw here in the paper. And the law is saying that like I cannot get this money until I decide that I'm going to leave the country.
Kavla Ved, an Israeli NGO that advocates for workers' rights, has seen the number of complaints by African asylum seekers double in the past few months alone.
Today, only African migrants pay 20% of their salary. It should encourage them to live. Israel doesn't really care where they would live. Many people discover at the last minute that the money that was taken from their salary was not actually deposited. The employer keeps it in his pocket.
African asylum seekers say they are also shut out of the Israeli healthcare system. Officials of the Physicians for Human Rights, an NGO that advocates for the health of African asylum seekers, say Israeli doctors are not allowed to treat African asylum seekers unless their life is in danger.
We had a male patient suffering from severe heart disease, and the doctor said that he must undergo heart surgery, open heart surgery, but because it's still considered an elective procedure, he was unable to access it unless he collapses and brought to the ER. It is only then that he would receive treatment. We actually wrote the Ministry of Health and begged them to assist him and to make this procedure available for him, because all the doctors who saw him said that it's a matter of days or weeks until he might lose his life. But the Ministry of Health responded by saying that we're not responsible for that individual because he's an asylum seeker, because he's not a resident of Israel, and therefore the only thing we can do is promise you that once he collapses, he will receive treatment through the ER.
Today we are asking asylum, protection, to be recognized as refugees in this democratic country of Israel.
Thousands of asylum seekers in Tel Aviv recently rallied to demand an end to laws that make them illegal residents in Israel. But some Israelis say the laws don't target Africans. Yonatan Yakubowitz of Israel's Immigration Policy Center says it aims to simply stop illegal migration.
The official Israeli policy is we are uninterested in massive illegal immigration. We are never sending anyone back to a country that will be in danger. We are giving the basic minimal rights like free tuition for children and healthcare, but we are not giving the full rights that will generate a pull factor and will allow people to stay here indefinitely.
For more than a decade, Israel has only granted less than 1% of refugee status to asylum seekers. And rights groups say Israel's refusal to grant asylum goes against the 1951 UN Convention on Refugees, which Israel has signed. It says refugees have a right to not be punished for illegal entry into the territory of a contracting state. and they shouldn't be expelled. And they have a right to work, housing, education, to freedom of movement and religion. They also have a right to access the courts. Israel only gives children of asylum seekers free tuition and medical care. Asylum seekers can seek legal representation in Israel. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu views African asylum seekers as illegals with only one choice and promises to flush them all out.
למסתננים יש ברירה פשוטה, לשתף איתנו פעולה ולצאת מרצון בדרך מכובדת, בדרך אנושית ובדרך חוקית, או כמובן נצטרך להפעיל את הכלים האחרים העומדים ברשותנו, גם הם לפי החוק. אני מקווה שיבחרו לשתף איתנו פעולה.
No matter what it takes.
מדיניות מאוד ברורה. אנחנו עוסקים במסתננים בלתי חוקיים. לא בפליטים, מסתננים בלתי חוקיים. והזכות של מדינת ישראל היא לשמור על גבולותיה ולהרחיק מתוכה מסתננים בלתי חוקיים.
Nearly 4,000 African asylum seekers have since left the country. And last year, the Israeli government planned to forcibly relocate all African migrants to Rwanda and Uganda. They were to be given a one-way ticket and $3,500. But the plan fell apart at the last minute. So did a deal with the UN to relocate 16,000 African asylum seekers to Germany, Italy, and Canada.
Johanna, viens. Voilà, c'est bon.
Unlike the Eritreans and Sudanese, Congolese asylum seekers were the first African asylum seekers to arrive in Israel in 1997 during the First War in the DRC. They were given what's called group protection status that allows them to work, but not refugee status.
They accepted us, but they considered us people who only cannot be deported for now. But we are waiting for a time that they can be deported to deport them. So it was just a temporary protection.
Last year, the government said they no longer needed protection.
We didn't really understand what made the government declare Congo safe. So it became, it created again fear, because we started remembering why you left. You are going back to the same situation. Your life will not get any better. Your security will not get any better. So it will be like going back to hell.
Mutunwa and his family will remain in Israel until the Ministry of Interior can justify that the DRC is a safe place to return. There are about 400 asylum seekers from the DRC who are in the same situation as Christian. The Israeli Supreme Court has ruled against their immediate deportation by the Ministry of Interior, but it did not issue an order to restore their protection status, which will shield them from deportation at a later date. For Mutunwa, returning to Congo with his family after 12 years in Israel is not an option. He'd been receiving death threats for investigating allegations of human rights abuses against the government during the Congo War.
I came alone. If, for example, I was alone, I was to be sent back home. As I came alone, for me, I could manage maybe to survive. But now, even my family status has changed. I'm not going alone anymore, but I'm going with a family. And you know now, if a parent is in danger, it's the entire family which is in danger.
We are human beings. We need justice. We are human beings. We need...
Some Israeli leaders say The presence and overall treatment of thousands of Africans living in Israel is exploited by politicians.
There is racism, but more than racism, there is hatred. They know that it is very easy to incite about those people, those poor people, and to make hate, to make the public hate them and afraid of them, and then they get power.
The treatment of African asylum seekers raises questions about Israel's respect for human rights.
Coalition is against human rights. It's not only a question of the Africans, it's not only question of the asylum seekers. I fight for human rights for women, for LGBT, for Palestinians in the occupied territories, Palestinian citizens of Israel. And this is not human rights era. The government, the coalition they minimize human rights all the time.
But the treatment of African asylum seekers has not stopped Netanyahu's government from renewing diplomatic ties with their leaders.
All African countries, all of them without exception, can benefit from a renewed cooperation with Israel. I've said before and I'll say it again, Israel is coming back to Africa and Africa is coming back to Israel.
In 2016, Benjamin Netanyahu became the first Israeli prime minister to travel to Africa in decades. So far, he has visited Uganda, Kenya, Rwanda, Ethiopia, and Chad. Netanyahu is positioning Israel as a new trading partner in agricultural and technological industries. He announced a $13 million investment deal with East African countries during his visit. Israel's return to Africa has been 40 years in the making. Once close collaborators, the country lost its influence on the continent after the Six-Day War in 1967, as African leaders rallied behind Palestine. But that's clearly changing.
We don't believe that isolation is a solution. We believe that engagement is a solution, even though we have different positions different countries might have.
Netanyahu's recent visit to Africa reveals Israel's economic and security ambitions. But the price would be a return as an observer with the African Union.
This is something that Kenya will continue to push to see how Israel can regain her observer position at the African Union.
A seat at the AU could allow Israel to lobby African leaders for votes in international organizations like the United Nations. And this could divide the support of African leaders on Arab issues. But Netanyahu has faced little backlash for his treatment of Africans in Israel.
On one hand, they act against the asylum seekers. On the other hand, they are more and more popular in Africa. If the African leaders give a condition to the Israeli government, you should improve the conditions of the asylum seekers, you should stop those talking about deporting them, then they will stop because they want good relations with the African nations.
And for the thousands of Africans stuck between two worlds, a stronger Israel-Africa alliance may not mean the end of their misery in Israel.
They're showing very good diplomatic relations with Africa, but African people here were homeless and suffering. Treat African people here good, because they may be future, because like 90% of Africans live here, they're into the age of 20s to 30s. We are young here.
But right now, with the laws stacked against them in Israel, many African asylum seekers would say Israel is being anything but good.